So, how do you play fiddle tunes faster? How do you go from playing like this to playing like this? This is a question that I get asked a lot on my channel, so I thought I would make an entire video devoted to learning how to play tunes faster. So to play tunes faster, there are a couple things that need to go on, but most importantly, there needs to be good coordination between your left violin hand and your right bow hand. And this starts by having a good right bow hand. So I'm going to put my violin down. By a good right bow hand. It's very difficult to get a good right bow hand. When I first started learning how to play, I ended up with something like this, and the thing is though, when you have a kind of a not so good bow hand, it works for like the first little bit of your playing, but then eventually you'll hit a wall where, well, at least I hit a wall, where I literally could not play certain songs with a bow hold like this. Like, there were certain strokes that I couldn't do, and the reason for that is because I had no flexibility in my wrist, and having that extra flexibility, although it might not be necessary for like when you're a beginner, it will become very important later on. So, and when I tried to correct my bow hold from this to this, like fairly late in the game, it was the most frustrating thing to try to correct. And in order for me to go to that next step and play faster, I had to correct it. So we're going to talk about a good bow hold kind of really fast. Now, you always want to have a nice curved thumb, kind of like that. You never want it to be like this. This is not flexible, but this is nice and flexible. So you always want a nice curved thumb. And you put the tip of your thumb, this tip right here, right in this little pad area, just like that. It's going to just kind of hang in there. And then you are going to curve your thumb around like that. It's just going to be nice and curved. Now, this is kind of awkward to start out with. So there's a couple of things that you can learn to do. One is to lean your thumb against the hair of the bow. Although normally you're not supposed to touch the hair of your bow. This is just training yourself how to have a good curved thumb. So that's one way. And if that is just super duper awkward, you can just put your thumb on the bottom of your bow. That's a good beginner way. Just know that's not forever. That's just to get used to having a curved thumb. Eventually you're going to want to sneak it in between this pad area. It basically goes right there. Just put your thumb there. Then we have our pinky. It sits on the top of the bow, kind of like that. And between your thumb and your pinky, you should be able to hold the bow. Definitely do this over carpeted area or your bed. Then you put your ring finger over the eye of the bow. Your middle finger goes right next to it, and your index finger is a little bit interesting. As you go up and down in the bow, it actually, like the stick of the bow slides between this knuckle here and this knuckle. So it's always between these two knuckles. It's never over here, it's never over there, and it's never like up, pointed up here. It's always sliding between these two knuckles. So as a beginner, like, you don't have to like work on your slide between the knuckles. Just make sure that it's somewhere between these two knuckles. And it's best to have it, I like to put mine like right here between the winding, the metal winding, and the pad. So that's where I keep it, and it should look something like this. Would be a good bow hold. Now, the next super important thing is the wrist. So now the wrist should always be in an extension of your hand, kind of like this. It should never be anything like this or any sort of bent wrist at all. It should just be rather straight. It can bend as you play, but when your hand is just out, try to make sure that it is like an extension of your lower arm, kind of like that. And then as you play, there's a little bit of bending, but it's mostly a side to side sort of movement rather than an up and down. So we just kind of go side to side, sort of like that. So that is a good bow hold to start out with. The next thing to talk about is a good left hand posture. So when you play violin, one of the things that is I like to borrow from classical music and I find very helpful is a shoulder rest. And there's also like, it's a combination between your chin rest, like how deep it is, and how your shoulder rest sits. But ideally, to maximize your ability to play fast, you're going to want to not have to support your hand or your violin with your hand at all. So I'm like no hands, it's staying very much on my shoulder in a very upward position. This is a very classical looking position, but it works with fiddle music too. But even like if it was down, kind of more fiddly, it's no hand is needed to really support the instrument. This is really important for being able to play fast. So I would recommend investing in a good shoulder rest. The one that I use was actually recommended by a viewer, and it is the Bon Musica, well, it's in German, Schulze Stütze Violin 4/4. It's a really good shoulder rest. It's very bendable and it just kind of hooks onto your shoulder with this cool little hook thing. So I really like it. It's kind of expensive as far as shoulder rest goes, but I really like it. Now, the next thing to talk about that I often see is the left hand position. So we're going to talk about everything going on with the left hand. I often see beginners, they have this sort of like wrist against the neck of the violin thing going on, and it feels quite comfortable to play like this when you first start. You have like your whole hand resting against the violin. It's easier to figure out where the pitches are relative to like your palm of your hand. It makes it seem like it's a little bit easier. But lifting your fingers off the fingerboard with your hand in a position like this is actually really hard to do, and you're making yourself work like 20 times harder than it needs to be. What you want is, similar to the bow hand, a flat wrist. It can wobble a little bit for vibratos, but for the most part you just want it to be nice and flat. Your thumb, you don't want it like directly under. Let's see, can you turn it on? You don't want it directly under, you don't want it like hanging up like this. You want it kind of off to the side, sort of, something like that. Everyone kind of puts their thumb in a different spot. It's not too big of a deal, just as long as it's not hanging up like this or like, you know, flying off the instrument or something. Just kind of off to the side. But make sure, the most important thing is that this wrist is not like this, it's like this. You can like lift your instrument up briefly, but just make sure that it goes straight back to that flat position. Now, the next thing that I see a lot of is the elbow here, this elbow. A lot of the times it feels comfortable to kind of, this is an exaggeration, but have it pointing this way. And it feels a little bit more, you know, a little bit more comfy to have it kind of out here, you know, not quite like that, it's more like this. But as an exaggeration. However, when you play like that, like I can barely reach the notes on the G string. It is super hard. And if I were to shift, like, oh goodness, the pinky is no longer functionable. However, if you bring this elbow around and have it point more towards where your bow hand is, all of a sudden these strings open up and I'm able to go way up high all along these G string. It's a lot more easier. So make sure your elbow is always pointing off to this side. This will free you up to fly all over your instrument much faster than like trying to reach the notes like this. So keep your elbow around. An exercise that I used to do was when I first started, I would just kind of hold it like this for a few, like I'd hold it for like a minute And it's kind of hard to hold your hand like that if you've never had your elbow. It feels really weird. But you know, I'd hold it for a bit and I'd be like, okay, and kind of like shake it out a bit. And then as I got more used to this kind of awkward stretch, I was able to grab the side of my instrument and hold it for, like, now I could probably hold it like this for like 5 minutes and not feel weird. But most importantly, if it ever starts to hurt and you ever start to like stop, like don't keep pushing yourself, just it's time to take a break, put the instrument down. There's no such thing as no pain, no gain with the violin. If it hurts, it's time to take a break. So just, you know, take it easy with that, but get used to kind of bringing your elbow around, because that will definitely open up your hand, your left hand. So that's like positioning stuff. That's like the very first step, is getting used to a good bow hand and a good positioning of the instrument with your left hand. The next really important thing is muscle memory. And there's two kinds of muscle memory. There's one, the first is where you know where all the notes are on the violin itself. So if I were to say, where is the D? You might go, you know that it's the third finger on the A string. You could go up here in third position if you wanted to play it up there. It's an open string, you know, F sharp. You know where all the notes are. That is muscle memory. You basically have to just remember that an F sharp is the second finger on your D string, and it's a raised second finger. Now, to learn muscle memory of where all the notes are on the violin, I did two things. The one that I wish I had done a lot more of, and is probably the most common, is to practice scales. And it's one of those things that when you're just starting to learn, you don't really understand the importance of scales, but it actually teaches you all the different intervals, the nuances between the different notes, where they are on the violin, and intonation. So you start to hear whether or not it's in tune or not, and you can easily check your own pitches with the scale. Like if you were wondering if you're sharp or flat, you'd be able to go back to the scale and play up to the note and be like, oh, look, I guess I was a little bit flat, or, you know, make adjustments as necessary. So scales are super important, and I didn't do them as much as I should have, and it really shows in my playing now. So if you are learning, I would recommend doing scales every day before you start practicing a tune or anything really. Just do a scale or two. Just play a couple of scales and just get used to listening to the intervals between the notes and paying attention to where those pitches fall on the actual instrument itself. Now, it's really difficult to learn pitches when you just have a violin that doesn't have frets. It's like, well, you know, you can kind of guess. It's like, oh, that sounds sort of right. So what I did more of when I was a little kid, teenager actually, was I played along to recordings, and I played along to the radio. My mom had a piano. I often would like play the notes on the piano, which were like concrete notes, and I'd find the pitch on my violin. And I found that this was very helpful for learning intonation without doing a lot of scales, although it's not a substitute. Definitely practice scales. I'm starting to practice scales way more than I used to, and they're really helping. So yes, playing along to recordings or playing along to the radio will really you'll start to train your ear about where the notes are relative to the violin, because you'll be able to match the pitches, and that's super important for gaining muscle memory about where they are on the violin, because it's a big guessing game here. So that's the first kind of muscle memory. The second kind of muscle memory is muscle memory regarding the actual tune itself. Now this is a little bit weird, and I can't quite describe it in any way other than it's almost like my hands have a mind of their own and they just sort of know what to do. It sounds kind of crazy, but as you practice songs over and over, it starts to make a little bit more sense. Basically, when I play a tune, I'm not thinking about the note that I play next or really how the tune goes at all. I'm just, if anything, I'm thinking about where I'm taking a phrase, or maybe what I'm going to play next, or if I'm really not paying attention, what I want to eat for dinner. So like, my hands know what to do, and my mind can kind of wander or pay attention depending on how serious I am at the moment. And to get to that point takes practice. And there's a couple of things that I do to push myself to that point, especially when I was first starting out. And the first is a metronome, everyone's favorite device. This is basically a little device that will click at, you can pick your beats per minute here. It'll click a steady tempo for you, and this is the quartz metronome matrix. I like this metronome, it's very nice. So I like that. But basically what I do is I would find a tempo that I'm comfortable playing a tune. So maybe it's that tempo. I'm happy playing the tune at that tempo. I find that tempo on the metronome. I'm not sure what that was. That's about 108. And I would play it at 108, work out all the bizarre notes. Sometimes it's a little weird practicing with metronome. It takes like a couple tries. But once you get the hang of like where the notes fall on the downbeats and each beat individually, then I'd click it forward one beat. So I'd repeat the tune again. And then if I played it without any mistakes, I'd click it forward one more metronome beat. And I'd keep doing that until I hit a mistake. And as soon as I hit a tempo where I can no longer play it anymore, I would back it up 5 clicks, play it again 5 times, which sounds incredibly tedious and maybe overkill. However, a lot of people practice until they get it once, and then they're like, oh, I got it, now I can move on. But the problem with that is they practiced it a good 5, 6, 8 times incorrectly before they got it the once. So you want to be able to play it at a tempo where you can do it correctly 5 times in a row before you move on to the next tempo. So that's kind of something that I did a lot. It's incredibly tedious and something that isn't the most enjoyable because you just are repeating it over and over again. But it will pound it into your brain how the tune goes, and you'll notice within a couple of practice sessions that you're able to play the tune significantly faster when you start off like the next day even. The next idea is one that I learned when I was at the university, and I wish I knew it sooner because I think it's better than the metronome way, although this is a pretty solid way to work out. I wouldn't say work on entire songs doing this, but like just measures or two. Like if there's a particular part in a song that's just driving you crazy and you just can't do it, I would recommend the metronome way. However, if you're trying to speed up an entire tune, I've learned this new way, which works pretty well. And I call it the hornpipe and reverse hornpipe method. So basically, you play the tune first at your comfortable tempo. And then you play it again, only this time like a hornpipe. And now we play it again, only instead of, you know how a hornpipe's like long note, short note, long note, short note? Instead of doing that, we're going to do short note, long note, short note, long note. We're just going to flip it. So it'd be like... So compare that to... We're going... It's a big brain twister and it's difficult to do, but it's easier to do that than play it super fast. At least I think it's easier, because you're basically chopping the song up into little chunks where you are playing all the notes with all the string crossings at a very fast tempo. It's just they're split up between the short notes and the long notes, whereas when you play it fast, there's no breaks, you just are going. So it's nice to have the like little breath between the long notes, and but it's important to also practice the reverse. Not always just play it like a hornpipe, because then you only practice half the string crossings and half the fast tempo notes. So it's important to flip it. So, and then, and make sure to do the same bowing too. Don't change the bowing to compensate for the awkwardness of the second one. But once you've gone through, you played it the hornpipe and the reverse hornpipe, then try to just play it faster, and you'll perhaps notice, at least I would often notice, that I could play it significantly faster after I had done that crazy brain twister stuff, and I was able to play it much faster. So that's one way. It works best with more like 4/4, 2/4 kind of songs. I've tried to do it with jigs and it gets a little bit weird just because of the 6/8 with the 6/8 notes per measure. It just gets a little bit awkward. So I would recommend it more for reels, and but that is definitely a way that I use like religiously now. It's an amazing way. Now the last point that I want to talk about is when I play something fast, like there's a turning point where I start to play violin differently, and I can't really describe when that happens, but I'll explain what I mean. So when I, for example, for my tutorials, I play things really slowly. So it's like, so what I'm doing is I'm using big bows. When I'm changing strings, I'm doing rather large motions and throwing in some vibrato that probably wouldn't happen if I was playing really fast. So I'm playing violin very differently, and some of those traits can carry into faster tempos, but only up to a point. There will become a moment where instead of using your whole arm, you have to start to just use your wrist, which goes back to why it's super important to have a nice flexible one. So for example, if I were to play fast using that same big motion, I would get super exhausted. It would be something like, I'd be like doing this really big motion and I'd get super tense in the shoulder. I'd be exhausted after 5 measures, and I wouldn't be able to sustain that kind of movement. There's just too much going on. So instead, what I do is there's kind of this box. So you have your upper arm, your lower arm, your bow, your violin. It makes this little box. I feel like this is the most comfortable like part of the bow to be able to play really fast. That's like my personal opinion. But what I do is I practice with this kind of position how small of a bow movement is actually necessary to change your strings. It's not very big. Do that with each string. Try to find where the very slight movement is to where you can change the strings. You don't necessarily have to do like big motions. It can just be It's very small motion, or it can be. Unless you're playing slowly, then it's kind of good to do big motions. It helps add character, but if you're playing fast, you don't want to do big motions. Now the other thing is, a lot of times when I'm changing bows, like changing strings at a slow tempo, I move my whole like bow arm. It does this kind of elevator motion, and that's great for slow stuff, but if you're playing fast, you don't want to be doing this, like, that's too much. So it's actually kind of just a wrist. You don't have to do your whole arm. And by having a flexible wrist, you'll be able to change strings, play notes really, really fast without much movement at all. And that is, I think, the key to being able to play at those really crazy fast tempos. Like, you can go fast, you can do fast, like more movement, but if you want to go really fast, it's all in the wrist, really. So as I start to increase tempos, I go from the to just a wrist movement, so kind of from big movements to just the wrist sort of thing. So that's, it's an awkward thing to practice. One thing that I would recommend is to just play it slowly, but to just do it with the wrist. It's super awkward when you were first starting, but let's see, it would sound like... Sounds really bad that way, and that's why I play differently when I play slow. But when I play fast, I really am doing... I am just doing it in the wrist. So that's... You can't really demonstrate how to do it slowly without it sounding kind of weird. So that's when I teach the tutorials, I'm doing the big bows to make it sound good, but I don't play like that when I'm playing it fast, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But those are, I guess, the tips. I think that's everything. Oh, a little last tip that I used to struggle with, and I still do to some extent, you'll see me doing this, is when I was first learning, I had this thing where I would like throw my fingers in the air as I played. I'd be like, yeah, I'm like totally playing violin, and I'm just, you know, I know where the note is. And I'd have my, like, all my other fingers flying off the fingerboard. And it's kind of comfortable. It makes it easier to do vibrato when you do that to some extent. It's kind of hard to do vibrato when all your fingers are down. It's not impossible, but I think that's maybe why I started to do that. But when you do that, like, and you're trying to move really fast, like, you have to, like, move your fingers at a much further distance. So it's better to keep them down on the fingerboard as much as you possibly can. So, like, let's say, for example, when I'm playing those notes, I'm not lifting my C sharp off the fingerboard. That would be like, it's kind of tempting to do that kind of stuff, but as you like start to do more vibrato, it feels like better to just leave your fingers off. But try to keep your fingers, if you're playing fast in particular, try to keep as many fingers down, like ready to play as possible. And it's really awkward at first. Something that I used to do, excuse me, to practice that is I'd play a note and I'd keep my finger on that note until I had to use the same finger to play a different note, or if the note was in the way of, like, maybe I want to play open D and it's on an E, well then I have to lift it up. But try to keep your finger on the note for as long as you can. So like maybe you played a G and now you're on the E string doing like an F sharp. keep the G down. Just get used to leaving it there. And that will sort of train you to keep your fingers more closer to the fingerboard. It feels weird to have it just kind of sitting there while you're doing other stuff. But doing that helped me learn to keep my fingers on the fingerboard, which that minimizes the motion in your left hand, which when you're playing fast, if you can minimize as many motions as possible, that would be the best. So I hope this video has helped, and I hope you have fun practicing. Bye!